One thing that's more important than models is the agent that you choose. When we notice value that bumps up, it's not always the model that's improving so much, it's typically the agent. But one thing above that, when we actually identify, oh, we're one-shotting this a ton more, this is, it's understanding what we want to do, it's really the quality of the context that really makes the model sing and purr and really, really work well. So thank you very much for coming to this session. We had over 100 people register, and you fine fellows and ladies joined us. I must admit, I'm probably questioning your thought process, because it's lovely outside and I'd probably prefer to be outside in the garden, maybe with a beer or something like that. So thank you, nevertheless, for coming to join us. I thought I was giving a different session, but this is Context is King. Over the last 30 minutes, I've just been trying to cram a 75-minute session into what's hopefully going to be 20 minutes. So here we go. Apologies if we go a little bit over. But this is a session, Context is King. And I really want to focus on the value that context gives us when we're building with agents. Now, 2025, last year, it was all about how we as companies can go as fast as we possibly can, or rather, as fast as we can adopt agents. So how can we increase our usage of agents as much as possible? This year, it's all about how can we use them effectively? How can we get the most out of them? How can we get value out of them? And that ROI in terms of what we're spending. And this really comes down to a number of things, but one of them is the model you choose. So obviously tokens cost money, some are going to be better than others, but one thing that's better, as we've found out, than models, or more important than models, is the agent that you choose. Because when we notice value that bumps up, it's not always the model that's improving so much, it's typically the agent that rotates and loops, getting the best out of the model. But one thing above that, when we actually identify, oh, we're one-shotting this a ton more, this is, it's understanding what we want to do, it's really the quality of the context that really makes the model sing and purr and really, really work well. So context for me is how you get the most out of your agent, and getting the most out of your agent, or rather using an agent, is how you get the most out of your model. So these three things in combination will get you to that real value. Let me give you a quick example. This is something I did a little while back, actually, so numbers may change. But here you can see I'm actually running some tests against a skill. And in this case, the skill is the Fastify Best Practices skill. And you can see I'm using several models with several agents here, Opus, Sonnet, and Haiku. And you can see the scores that they get in terms of how good every single model is at performing certain tasks. And you can see, yes, you would expect Opus to do well, but with the skill, there's actually not as much of a difference between them. And when you think about the cost that is incurred with these, the actual value, the ROI, is actually far, far smaller in difference between these models once you've started using context and using skills. Okay, so we talked about context a little bit, but what do we mean by context? This is an important question. Well, anything that the agent can really access, whether that's in its memory, whether it's the files that are local to the system, whether it's things that we load in like skills and rules, whether it's documentation around third-party libraries or our own proprietary libraries that we create and provide to it. It could be even our messages. That all adds up as context for the agent, and test outputs, whether it's linters or whatever that gets run and passed back in. All of this becomes context. And we'll dig into a couple. The first one we're going to look at is rules, and how you can use rules within your agent as context. Now, rules are essentially constraints, behavioral constraints that an agent will always read. Typically, these tend to be in something like I'm not sure if I've got, no, very often in something like a Claude MD, things that the agent will always go through. These are things that you should always do, not just based on what the user is asking, but you should always do these things, very often organizational rules and things like that. Skills, on the other hand, are much more dependent on the actual task or the act that the agent's doing. So they're kind of like, you can think of them a little bit more like callable procedures. When you need them, you call them. When you need them, you invoke them. They're not always fully read. They're disclosed progressively as and when the agent feels like it wants to use that thing. There are a couple of reasons why sometimes it will or won't use it. If it thinks it can do something itself, it may not actually use the skill, but we'll look at that in a little bit. So the practical distinction is rules are passively run. They're always there, and they shape everything the agent does. A skill is triggered for that specific job. When we look at a skill MD, and we'll dig a little bit deeper into skills now, there are really two pieces of this metadata at the very top, which are mandatory: the name and the description. And the description, of course, is super important because that's all, the name and the description are all that the agent has to load in order to know whether it activates it or not. And an activation of a skill is an agent saying, look, I think I need more information in this skill to do to perform this task. I will read more and I will load more of that skill into context. And it can choose how much of that skill it does load into context based on the task. So, when we think about skill activation, it goes from knowing nothing to knowing exactly what it needs, like in an instant, and that's the key. So the way it does this is by loading things into the context window. Now, the context window is essentially that it's a finite piece of memory, finite piece of area that contains a number of everything that I said. Files in the file system, skills, maybe project files or user files. And there's absolutely a Goldilocks zone. Don't be kind of like, thinking that area, that skill, that context window, I can fill it completely, and an agent will work just as well with a full context window as with a small context window. The Goldilocks zone is if you provide too little context for a task, it will perform the task, but it may not do it the way you wish that task to be carried out. So maybe it makes decisions that you actually prefer things being done in a different way. When there's too much context, it overwhelms the agent. And when you overwhelm the agent, you effectively degrade the performance because it's actually missing key pieces of information. So what you want is this Goldilocks zone, this just right zone. If you haven't heard of the Goldilocks zone, and it's obviously the three bears, but I love to think of it as the distance from a star which a planet has to be to actually hold life. If it's too close, it's too hot. If it's too far, the bacteria, et cetera, won't grow. So that's the Goldilocks zone. So you can always see your context state / context in Claude Code, for example, and you'll see how your context window is filled. And like I say, there are a bunch of different window sizes, but don't be fooled into thinking you can completely fill that window without the performance degrading. Okay, you can also, just as well as adding things to the window, you can obviously free up those tokens, and you can do that through compaction. It happens automatically using things like, when you fill up your context window, you'll get automatic compaction. One thing that people don't always know is you can compact very often with instructions afterwards to say, when you do it manually, /compact, I want to do this thing afterwards, and it will summarize based on knowledge of what you are trying to achieve next. So it'll keep things in the context window so that it doesn't have to reload anything else in because it knows enough of what to do next. Cool. I'm going to do a skills demo, and then we're going to jump through potential problems of what we as an organization may face when doing this more at scale. So as part of this skills demo, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an app that I've been working on over the last couple of days, which is called Talk to Skill. And Talk to Skill, oh cool, it's just finished, that's awesome. Talk to Skill is an application that uses a skill itself, but we're going to be running this live at DevCon, the conference that was just mentioned. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn every single talk, every single session into a skill. Why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you want to ask some Q&A of that that speaker, that speaker. Maybe you want to learn or bounce some ideas off someone, or say, how do I do this with my project? And you can use that skill to get good advice from the lessons learned in the session with your scenario. So in this case, just today, Guy Poe, our founder, demoed his session that he's doing, the keynote session, at our weekly lunch and learn at lunchtime. Now, what this does is, this actually takes from a granola folder. So every single time a granola transcript is captured, it throws it into a folder. And when we recognize, so this refreshes every 30 seconds or so for now, when we recognize something new comes in, we have a skill that automatically creates a session skill and publishes it across to Tessel. Then it does a number of other steps, which I'll go into in just a sec. But here I can see, if I was to come here I can see we have the full transcript. We have a bunch of quotes. We have a tile.json. So this is the version of the skill which we've uploaded into Tessel, and an outline that describes, essentially what we are. What the session is about. And this skill MD, which has a name, it has a description, and some other things, how to use this skill and so forth. Now, if I was to come over here, you will see I have this skill that exists. I can install it, so I can run npx tessel install, and I'll do that in just a second. And information about how to use this skill and the kinds of things that I should do. So let's go ahead and actually play with this. So if I was to run a tessel install, or in fact, let's just copy and paste and use that straight out the box. I've now installed that tile or that plugin which contains the skill into my environment. Now if I run Claude and say, tell me about tell me why I should consider context to be like code. Let's see if it auto activates my skill. There we go. It's activated that skill. It reads the outline. It's obviously doing some work and actually loading the relevant pieces into my context. And it should hopefully, depending on how Claude is today. Who's still using Claude? I've heard so many people who's switched from Claude to Codex in the last 2 weeks, last month. A few people. Okay, 3 people. Very, very interesting. I was just talking with Alan in the office just now, and I was saying, my God, I just asked it to create me a very simple skill for this demo, and it's taken 3 minutes to create a pirate skill. Why is it taking so long? And I think it's just like the deep thinking is just crazy. Anyway, where was I? Okay, skills are already behaving like code. It gives me quotes. It gives me more information. And now I might actually say, okay, what do I do to this? What do I do to this skill to treat it like code? It will probably say, okay, you need to version it. You need to do these various things. I might say, tell me. He talks about a CDLC. I think there it is. There's the CDLC. Tell me about the CDLC. And so forth. And I can now ask questions and get clarification. This is hopefully, fingers crossed, like I'm talking with the speaker using those quotes and potentially other information outside as well. Okay, so this is going to be available for every single session live that we do at DevCon, little bit of fun. A couple of other things. When we do this within Tessel, the first thing, in fact, let me go back to the app. The first thing I do is we create the skill and we publish it to the registry. If I go to the history, I added this just today, I build the skill and I publish it to the registry as version 101. Then I review the skill because one of the big questions is, how do we know if this skill is any good? So I review it, and that basically checks if the skill meets the best practices, the quality that we have seen from Anthropic's best practices, I think not Codex, Cursor's best practices that they have published, and it validates, is this similar to those best practices? It makes those changes, then it performs optimization, and optimization is really about the impact that this skill makes. In other words, if I was to ask this question without the skill, would the agent alone be able to provide me with a good enough answer? So we run the same tests with and without, and we identify how much of an impact that is. So we do all of that, and then we can provide that. If I go back to the TESOL registry, you can see right now, this is 1.3x times better than without the skill. You can see the quality's gone up to 90% from my original version, from my original 82%. So we're identifying what are the best practices we're missing, and then how can we update with those best practices. Okay. I'll mention, actually, we also run a security scan on this skill. This is TESOL, but this is not TESOL. I used to work at Sneak for like 6 years. I keep referring to TESOL as Sneak. I'm just starting, after 2 years at TESOL, I'm just starting to refer to Sneak as TESOL now. So I think it's balancing out. But this is a security report or a security scan run by Sneak, trying to identify, it's using LLM as a judge here, trying to identify potential malicious issues or bad security practices within my skill. And it will provide me, if I go here to my security, it will provide me with any security issues that could exist there. In my evals, why is that? I need to go to my correct version. In my evals, you can see where things are good and where things are bad, and in some cases, where things actually regress, where my context confuses the agent. And so this gives us insight into what the context is doing a good job at and where we need to actually improve. Okay, let's jump back to slides, and where's my slides? It's here. And I'll flick through a couple of additional, why are you not working? There we go. And I'll flick through a couple of important things that we should be considering as we start scaling our usage of skills, or really even as an organization or as an individual. So here are some scenarios. They've got 6 scenarios that we need to think about. Whether we use TESOL or something else, we should have a mechanism in place where we know how we can achieve these things. Your team or company write hundreds of skills. They're local. Essentially, each developer is writing them locally and using them locally. They're not discoverable by others. How do we unlock the value that one individual gets and effectively multiply that across a team or across an organization? So a really important way, we need some registry, we need some mechanism where others can find those types of skills. Your team install loads of skills. Every developer has a different set of skills developing on the same project. How do you achieve consistency across an org or a project? So maybe your organization say, do you know what? We need these skills always to be always on skills across every single team in our organization. That's important to mandate. Also, if I have a set of skills that I want everyone to use as a project, maybe it uses third-party library dependencies, maybe it needs to use a proprietary context for a proprietary library that I've developed, that context should be available to everyone. Otherwise, imagine lots of developers on a team all using different levels of knowledge. Some people don't even know about proprietary libraries, some people do. You just wouldn't have it. You'd constantly have pull request reviews saying you have to use this. We don't want to do it to people, we don't want to do it to agents either. I've got loads of skills installed. Are they being used correctly? Activation is a key problem. And I think I'll talk about that in just a second, actually. But how do I tell if my agent is actually activating? That's such a key piece, because there's no point getting our skills to be really good if we actually don't use them in practice. Dev teams install skills from everywhere. How do we audit and ensure we're not using poor security skills or malicious skills? This is all about the scanning, whether you Sneak directly or through a registry. So important from an audit point of view. We haven't yet hit that, oh shit, someone's deployed a malicious skill and it's really having problems in a production environment. It's a headline waiting to happen. This is a key one. You're after a specific skill. You know there are 5 developers all created the same skill. There's probably 20 more who have created other skills. Which one do you use? Which one is malicious? Which one is the highest quality? Which one has the biggest impact? You need to be able to understand, which are the better skills, and you need to be able to track where there are multiple skills and how you actually remove those skills from view. And finally, where you do get a bunch of skills, typically what you'll do is you'll get stale states, whereby things are moving on, certain things are stale. How do you keep that up to date? And this is very much thinking about context as code. You want to maintain that as your code changes, your context changes. As models change, your context will need to change because models will learn more. They'll know better, and your context will maybe need to remove things because the agents are good. So those are some things about how we scale. The last thing I want to talk about, and I'll do this in just a few minutes, is how when we are building skills, things that we should think about when we actually create the skills ourselves, when we actually write the skills. And we've learned this because, in fact, when we first gave this presentation at AI Engineer in London, this was the rate of skill growth in 14 weeks. We went from 12 skills in GitHub in November up to 5,500 skills in just 14 weeks. And it's probably way beyond that. We could probably refresh that number now. The key stat is once a skill gets added into GitHub, 9 times out of 10, it never gets updated. What are the chances of that skill being perfect out the box? Like virtually 0, right? So what did we do about it? Well, we decided to go on a mass pull request submission, which I guess some people loved, some people didn't love quite as much, but we were trying to help. And so we raised 622 pull requests. And we essentially kind of said, look, there's a whole bunch of things that we know are wrong with your skill. Can we send a pull request to try and make suggestions to help? And from that, we learned what are the key things that most people are failing at in their skills creation. The first one, and this is probably the biggest problem that developers generally have, is thinking, if I just write a crappy description because it's a description, I'll get away with it and I don't actually need it. But this is actually really, really important. And there are a number of things that are important within the description as well. If you can make that description specific to maybe tools that you use or technology that you use, the agent has a higher chance of using it because it has less in its memory and in its training data about this specific tool or this specific use case. So it's more likely to inject the skill context into that. So before, we very often see a helpful skill for code review and quality improvement. An agent knows how to do that anyway, or it thinks it does. But after, you're talking about running ESLint with project rules. This is very specific and it gets triggered much, much more. Here's quite a shocking stat. Only 41% of times will a skill activate if an agent isn't forced to use a skill. And by forced to use a skill, we're talking about using a / command in a task. So if you just say, I want to do this thing, and a skill exists, will that agent actually activate that skill to do it, or will it try and do it itself? 41% won't. And there are many reasons, one of which is God skills, a skill that tries to do everything. The one all-encompassing skill. And there's a few reasons why this can fail, and particularly with an activation. One, because, well, actually, if there are 50 things and I have a specific task, it might well activate a completely different skill in my plugin. There's just too much overlap between a number of skills. It'll either do that or it just won't activate at all. Context bloat is another one, and this is where you actually put so much context into your skill, the agent won't actually pull the right pieces from. Typically, and this is actually a best practice with Anthropic and so forth, they talk about keeping your skill MD below 500 lines. Optimized skills, interestingly, use 40% fewer tokens and tasks and complete tasks in half the time. And this is about either removing duplication or removing things that actually the agent most likely knows how to do anyway. And so all of this is about running evals and making sure your skill is all it can be. And that's everything. I hope that wasn't too long. But there's a ton more in this type of session, and perhaps I can share with you a full deck afterwards as well. Have I got time for questions? Yeah? A little bit. A very short question. Anyone have any questions or comments? Yes. Do we have a cube over there?
My question is, you said 41%. Have you tried anything like to force skill usage? I remember there were like for anthropic ones, you can use hooks to say like every turn, basically go check if you need to use skill or anything like that. Or is there anything else?
Yeah, so I mean, you can do the best way to force even if you use a hook and there are 100 skills that you have installed, the hook then still has to determine what the best skill to use. And it might be that it's just not used the right skill because it's way too complicated to learn to work out which the right skill is. So I think you could use hooks. You could enforce use of a skill by using a / command. But I think the biggest value, the biggest bang for your buck is fixing the description and actually fixing the way you bundle skills together. So breaking them up to make sure you've not got so many skills that is just confusing, or bringing smaller skills together so that when you have a number of things that you always want to do together, maybe that actually fits in a single skill. But I would say you can't improve on something you can't measure. So I think the biggest key is run evaluations, so we as part of our new skill optimizer, we run activation tests as well, and we have insights that show when your skills are getting activated as well. So I would say make sure, have a plan for measurement and then try to improve that. That could be hooks, but I think there are lower hanging fruit first and then hooks afterwards to say, hey, could you have improved this with a skill, and which skill would it be? Maybe you have a list of skills to use, but you're almost duplicating work there. Cool. Perhaps just one more. Yeah, the gentleman just here.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. Have you thought about, let's say, conflict? So let's say if you have an LLM model, okay, as you know that if, let's say, we talk about humans, let's say if you have two concepts, but if we're conflicting between those two models, two thoughts, let's say, in the beginning, then we would actually like lay them out probably on a piece of paper, and then basically do a comparison of sorts, right?
Yes.
So, okay, if I do that happened, that happened. But with an LLM, I think, do you think that there can be a huge conflict of either conflict interest or conflict between two skills at the same time?
I absolutely think so. And I think it gets to the stage where it's almost inevitable once you start adding lots and lots of skills to your environment. It's one thing that we are looking to add into our platform for the more enterprise style deployments, because they will have so many, we think they will have so many skills. What this needs to be is it's a harder thing to test, first of all, because you can't test them in isolation. It'll typically be when you install 50 skills from so many different places that all of a sudden then you have two people with differing opinions, and it has to pick one over the other, or weirdly it merges the two, and then actually you're not satisfying either skill. So what you then need is two things. You need, first of all, conflict detection to be able to say, okay, you've got two skills here that have a difference of opinion,
or even in similarity sometimes.
Yeah, or it could be, yeah. But then you need a merge resolution, and so it's like, okay, which one should win? And it's like, maybe the agent you can describe something with the agent, but more likely what it is you need a path to remove that conflict. So you need to either start removing a skill or adapting a skill so that it removes the conflict. But I think we're at the earlier stage where people are just starting to throw skills in. It's something that's bound to happen, and we can only kick the can down the road a little bit before it truly happens at a larger scale, for sure. Yeah, great questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
No worries, no worries.
At least I got to pique your interest.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. No, these are definitely things we've pondered. Awesome. I think I'm done for questions. Sorry, but I'll be here. I'm here all night. I'm here all week. So I'm gonna yield to the next speaker. But I appreciate everyone's attention on a beautifully sunny day. So thank you very much.